What factors influence support towards Quebec Charter of Values? POL 242, Montreal 2013. In order to examine this research question, I used the Leger 2013 dataset and tested 3 independent variables: region, education, and partisanship. The rationale behind this research question stems from the historical and growing nationalist sentiment in Quebec, largely due to the French-English dichotomy that exists. Certain factors, according to Thompson, influence nationalist sentiment more than others, not just in Quebec, and I wanted to see if these factors he discusses in his work can be found in Quebec. The analytics I will employ in order to test this is firstly a reliability index for my dependent variable, support for the charter, correlation matrix, a multivariate regression analysis, followed by a multi-model hierarchical regression, which I introduce a control variable. My reliability index for my dependent variable was created using 7 questions, which are all derivatives based off of this general question: according to you, should the Quebec government forbid or allow the display of religious symbols for people working in the following sectors? My Cronbach's alpha score of 0.96 was a little high, but I believe these questions were the best indicators, since religious freedom is one of the major components of the Quebec Charter. From low support to high support, my distribution table for my DV demonstrated that the majority of respondents showed high support, while nearly 20% demonstrated low support, with the rest in the middle. My 3 hypotheses were as follows. For region, respondents living in Montreal will have lower support for the Quebec Charter of Values. This is because, and Gantz argues, Montrealers have been raised in a culturally diverse city and embrace different cultures, ethnicities, and religions. I think they'll be more open and willing to accept different religions than those from outside Montreal. Secondly, for education, respondents with higher levels of education will show less support for the Charter. This is because, as Aaron discusses, Quebec has the highest dropout rate in North America, and so I think that having a limited education, and so does Aaron, leads to xenophobia and more closed-mindedness. Lastly, respondents who trust Marois' PQ party will be more supportive for the Quebec Charter values. Simply put, Handler discusses as far back as 1988 that the PQ supporters wish to preserve Quebec culture and language, something this charter explicitly attempts to do. The first variable in my correlation matrix was region. Since it was binary and nominal, we used a t-test and the mean in order to determine this correlation. The region's mean difference was negative 0.771. For the second variable, education, they got a Pearson's R value of negative 0.2378 with a p-value of 0. Also, the R squared was 0.056, indicating that 5.6% of the variation in the support index is attributed to education. Lastly, for partisanship, it was also binary and nominal, so we did another t-test and mean difference, and this time the mean difference was 3.32, which is quite significant. The study continues to analyze the effects of region, education, and partisanship on support for the Charter by undertaking multiple regression analysis. When analyzing each variable exclusively, the results reveal going from one region to another creates a positive 0.790 increase in support for the Charter with a p-value less than 0.01. The second independent variable, education, received a negative p-value of negative 0.245, also with a p-value less than 0.01. Indicating that moving from one level or unit of education to another higher one causes support for the Charter to go down by negative 2.45, or just under a quarter of a category decrease. Lastly, the third variable, named marois, revealed a positive relationship and that support in marois meant an increase in support towards the Charter by 2.243. Since b-values cannot be compared across independent variables as they are measuring different things, the results of the impacts of the independent variables must be done through analyzing their standardized beta coefficients. In this case, region ended up having the lowest standardized beta at 0.111, while education and partisanship received 0.129 and 0.430 respectively. What this reveals is that our third independent variable, partisanship, had the greatest impact on support for the Charter, while the 2 other variables marginally differed. Wanting to test this relationship further, a control variable of language was introduced to the regression analysis. Respondents were asked if they preferred to complete the survey in English or French. My first hypothesis for region tested for interpretation, and was that French respondents living in Montreal will show a decrease in support for the Charter for Quebecois values. This is rationalized by the work of May, who discusses how French Montrealers are not necessarily indicative of French Quebecers. Secondly, with regards to education, I tested for specification by introducing the multiplicative interaction term. My hypothesis was that for every level or increase in education, French respondents will show less support for the Charter of Quebecois values. May also supports this theory, discussing how educated Francophones will realize the detriment the Charter will have on the overall provincial economy going forward. In terms of my results, region demonstrated a partially spurious relationship since the b-value decreased once language was added to the regression model. I speculate that region is prior to language, and thus this relationship is partial interpretation. Also, using the rule of a third, the beta value for region drops by more than a third once language is introduced. Still, the relationship cannot be accepted with certainty since the p-value is greater than 0.005. Sorry, 0.05. In terms of education, the b-value nearly doubled once language was introduced to the regression model. We can conclude that there is once again a partially spurious relationship. We can also determine this with 99.9% certainty, having received the p-value less than 0.001. Furthermore, since I speculate that education is antecedent to language, the results reveal partial explanation. With regards to the control variable of language, the results were interesting and as hypothesized. They revealed that French respondents showed a positive 0.417 amount of support for the charter, while English respondents demonstrated a negative 3.46 amount of support for the charter with 99.9% confidence. This is a large b-value and an overall extremely weak amount of support for the charter from English Quebec. The adjusted R-square only increases from 24 to 25%, indicating that when language is introduced to the regression analysis, a minimal amount of variance in support for the charter is accounted for. One reason for this minimal increase is perhaps due to the fact that the majority of respondents were French. However, to be fair, the respondents represented the makeup of the Quebec population in terms of ratio between French and English citizens. My first hypothesis, therefore, French Montrealers demonstrated 0.310 support for the charter, proving my first hypothesis. Secondly, when it comes to education, for every increased level of education, French respondents demonstrated a negative 0.441 decrease in support for the charter. This also proved my first hypothesis. To conclude, it would be interesting to follow the developments of this topic as Quebec heads towards April 7th election. How would respondents answer these survey questions after the said election date? How would they answer 5 years from now? This is all something that should be explored at a later date. Thank you.